Hey everybody, Mike Griffith here. Welcome to the Ingles on the Beat segment. Very pleased today to be joined by Chris Doering, former Florida Gator star, former NFL receiver, now an analyst with ESPN. Chris, thanks for joining us today. How have things been going for you during this slowdown in our sports schedule?
Well, Mike, it's good to be on with you, man. I appreciate the opportunity to return the favor. You've been so kind with your time over the years on our show, and we appreciate that very much. So happy to be with you. It has been a little weird. Obviously, this would be the time we'd be busy doing spring tours with the SEC network and doing spring games. And to not have that going on right now, there's definitely a void that is left unfilled. But I'm here actually at my mortgage office where we're deemed to be an essential business as part of the housing market. Been really busy with that, so that's kind of kept my time kind of occupied, which is good.
Well, I don't know how many homes you're going to sell to Georgia fans on this broadcast, Chris. Maybe some condos if you rent any out. But it looked like you might have been taking out some of your frustrations on. Was that your son that you were hooping it up with in the backyard? You kind of took him to the hole there.
Yeah, my 16-year-old son. Actually, the previous time we played, actually beat me 2 out of 3. So I had revenge on my mind. I definitely went out there with a purpose, and it was supposed to be 2 out of 3. Beat him the first 2, and it ended up being 8 games where I just took him to school. And I told him, I said, hey, lessons aren't necessarily in the classroom. Sometimes lessons are taught elsewhere, and that's what we did on the hardboard that day, man.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Want to ask you about your playing career a little bit, Chris, before we get started. And I saw that record, 31 catches. Is that still tied for the most in the SEC with, what is it, Cooper? Did you also have 31?
Yeah, 31 career touchdown receptions is still the SEC record for the time being. Amari Cooper tied it a couple years ago. Jamar Chase is going to shatter it this season, assuming all goes well. He had a tremendous year, as we all know, in that 2019 national championship season. But for me, man, growing up growing up in Gainesville, a fan of the Gators, going to all the games as a kid, then having to walk on, and then to have left not only Florida but the SEC with that record and all the other great receivers that have played in this conference is really a sense of pride for me. And to hold on to it as long as I have probably is a little bit longer than my 15 minutes of fame should have allotted.
That's pretty cool. But, you did play in a pretty marquee offense and the fun and gun. And I'm trying to remember now, when I covered Alabama and Auburn, I don't know that we really triggered that whole fun and gun phrase. Seemed like 93, 94. And you started there, 91, 92? When did that fun and gun phrase really come into being that you recall?
Well, I mean, I think it was fairly early on. I mean, Shane Matthews, when Spurrier came in, Shane was the starter in 90. He won, SEC Player of the Year twice. They were throwing the ball around the yard. And at that point, I came in 91, got redshirted that year. The receivers on the roster at that time, Willie Jackson, Harrison Houston, Aubrey Hill, Trey Everett. I mean, they just had so many different guys that were really great players. Alonzo Sullivan. Those guys kind of took me under my wing. So we've had a long line of really good receivers during that Spurrier run. And I saw recently ESPN had Florida ranked as like the 9th best school when it came to receivers. I thought that was a little bit low given all the production, but was that phrase I think was fairly early on, maybe 91, 92, somewhere around there.
Well, you bring up those ESPN lists, and obviously you played against Georgia, and now you're an ESPN analyst. Were you surprised that the Georgia running backs weren't among the top 10 running back units?
It's a joke. I mean, Georgia running backs, every year you look at Georgia's depth chart. I mean, not only is there a superstar, but there's a number of guys behind that superstar that were top-rated 5-star recruits as well. So I think that was probably a glaring omission and certainly deserved to be on the list, if not high on that list. But I don't know how they do it. Even before Kirby, they've always been able to recruit running backs and have a lot of success with the production on the field with those guys.
Of course, now you played at Florida at a time when Florida was in control of that rivalry. And, one of the unique things about your era is you were a guy that was able to play in Sanford Stadium, the Swamp, as well as Jacksonville. And I'm not a Jacksonville proponent, especially now that Athens could really use all this money. They've been funneling to Jacksonville all these years. But Chris, what was that experience like playing in Sanford State? Obviously, Florida won the game big, but you had an opportunity to experience that. Your thoughts on the home and Jacksonville?
Let me go back and provide a little bit of background on this. Again, I mentioned, I grew up in Gainesville. My parents both graduated from Florida. I went to all the games as a kid. Now, we didn't have tickets. Oh, we had season tickets in the Swamp, but we didn't have tickets to the game in Jacksonville against Georgia. And that was always the game I wanted to go to. My dad refused to take us because every year it was disappointment, whether it was Buck Belue to Lindsey Scott, whether it was Herschel running, all over Florida 44-0. Like, those are the memories of my childhood. And so at one point in time, I had to sell programs over in Jacksonville in order to get in the stadium to watch a Florida-Georgia game. To me, it's the best rivalry in college football. It's the best setting being over there in Jacksonville, the half orange and blue, the half red and black. It's just iconic. And actually had a chance to have Herschel Walker on our show last night. To me, that's one of those guys that's a larger-than-life figure. And I just remember, all that he not only meant to Georgia, but to that rivalry, the SEC and college football as a whole. Still get butterflies when I was talking to him last night. So I've come to kind of transcend that dislike that I have for Georgia. I know that now, it's the same. Florida and Georgia are the same. Alabama, LSU, all of these schools in our conference have such great traditions and great players. And every time I go to Athens, they treat me so well there, despite being a Gator guy, that it's hard not to like the folks there at Georgia.
Yeah, especially at Georgia fans, they don't mind Florida so much now. They've won 3 in a row in the rivalry. Yeah. That's kind of how that goes. When I covered Tennessee, it was the dreaded Gators, and I guess that's why I have such an affinity for going to the Swamp as a road game, because watching those Tennessee Florida games and watching Auburn and Terry Bowden, I think you were on the field in that 1994 game when Auburn came in there and stunned you, and Terry Bowden, I think he still had that winning streak going, but the Swamp is such a unique place. It's a little boxy. It's certainly bright with all the orange, the unique traditions, and just the intensity. I mean, every stadium, I look at it like a birthday cake, right? Everybody likes birthday cake. There's different frosting and different flavors, and it's kind of like that. And Florida has its own, and man, it's bright and it's loud, and there's a certain taste to it. And I guess to me, that's why I wish for the Georgia fans that they could experience that. I guess I would ask you as a player, looking back then and now, what were some of the more memorable stadiums that you played in, and where do you like to go now? What stadiums stand out to you now?
Well, first of all, I don't think I ever really answered your last question. I apologize for that. As you mentioned, I was one of the few players at Florida, or Georgia for that matter, that got a chance to play in Jacksonville, to play in Gainesville, and play in Athens. And played in Gainesville on Halloween night. Georgia wasn't that good at that point in time, and we beat them pretty good that night. But for me, playing between the hedges was an iconic setting, and that was a game. I caught 5 touchdowns in the first half. 2 of them got called back. I caught 3 on the same drive, and with those 2 were called back, and subsequently was able to catch the one that ended up counting. But for me to have that game in Athens, between the hedges, against the team that caused me so many nightmares as a kid, was really fulfilling. And as you know, probably the story you've heard before about Spurrier understanding that nobody had ever put 50 on Georgia before, and being maybe a little overly aggressive offensively to make sure we got to that point. But I have I'm ashamed to admit it, I have a little small clippings of the hedges there at my house that are still in a book from that day. I was much more respectful with removing of that than what the South Carolina players were this year. But I will say that that's one of my favorite places to go. Auburn, as you mentioned, we had some trouble with Auburn back in the 90s. They beat us in 93 when we went there. In the 94, we were the #1 team in the country, and Frank Sanders caught that pass in the end zone to beat us there in the last minute or so of that game. We were finally able to beat them in 95 when we went to their place. But I just remember that 93 game. We were up 10-zip. We were about to go in. We were running a trips package to the right. I was singled up on the left.
Calvin Jackson. Jackson. I was there, man.
He signaled in a slant route to me. Danny misread it. He threw it to the wrong side. It picked 6 the other way. Instead of 17-0, it becomes 10-7. I remember looking up in the stands and seeing it vibrate. And I was thinking, man, I don't know if I've ever been in a setting as loud as what this is right now. So that was fun. Tennessee, going to Knoxville is always great there with Neyland Stadium as well. But you can't go wrong in the SEC. My big regret, Mike, though, LSU wasn't very good in the mid-'90s. And going to Baton Rouge, I never got to experience that Saturday night in Death Valley that everybody talks about. My senior year, we played them at, I think, 11:30 local time, at Jefferson Pilot, or 11 o'clock, whatever it was. It was a dead kind of setting, and we beat them. I think we we kind of trod through a 24-10 victory. But it just that's a place that I would have liked to have experienced at its best, highest, and best performance.
Yeah, I agree with you. I went through LSU there a couple times in the 90s as well. And it just, other than the Mike the Tiger exhibit, it really didn't hold any allure. It certainly wasn't as electric as it is now that it's gotten bigger and closed in. But, bigger's not always better. And I'll point to Alabama for that. And I don't know if you got to play. I don't think you got to play in Tuscaloosa.
No.
But the Tuscaloosa now, I just, it's Alabama, but it just doesn't. Auburn is a much better environment to me.
Yeah.
Tennessee is a better environment. Florida's a better environment. Georgia, I don't know what it is about the Alabama Bryant-Denny Stadium, but it just, the statues outside are cool, but inside, I don't know, Chris, it just doesn't do much for me.
Yeah, I've gone back as a broadcaster. It's great. I mean, that television booth is unbelievable, and they take great care of you there with the food in the press box. But we played Alabama during my time there in the SEC championship games, and as you remember, 92, 93, the initial year of the championship game in 92 was played in Birmingham. 93 we played in Birmingham. 92 might have been the coldest game I've ever been a part of, and that includes going to Green Bay in the NFL. That was miserable. So luckily we moved that to the Georgia Dome in 94. It became kind of a Super Bowl type setting and played them in an iconic matchup that year. But never got to experience Tuscaloosa against the Tide there in Bryant-Denny Stadium.
Yeah, I don't think now you wouldn't miss much. Back then it was a little bit more, more homey. I guess you could see the campus, but the thing is just so closed in now. It seems sterile. Speaking of that, there's something I wanted to, before we get into some of the current topics, Chris, looking over your career and, this is what I don't think I want people to realize about you. When you think about Florida and, the Gator swagger, and there's a certain cockiness about them and a certain arrogance. Dude, you're just straight blue collar. You were a walk-on. You were a local guy. I look at your career. You played in the doggone Arena League. I mean, that's somebody that just wants to play football. Played through all these different rosters: Jacksonville, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Denver. I mean, being that well-traveled. I mean, what was that like? I mean, it almost looks like every year you had a suitcase going to a different city just trying to make a squad.
Well, I grew up here in Gainesville. My dream was to play for the Gators. I went to PK Young, which was a K through 12 laboratory school, part of the College of Education. So I started there in fourth grade and graduated from there. And my dream was just to move from that campus over to the Swamp. And I was a record-setting wide receiver at that high school. My senior year, I tell everybody I had the greatest senior year in the history of high school senior years. I was all-state in football, all-state in basketball, all-state in baseball. We won the state basketball tournament. I was MVP of the state title. And, oh, by the way, I played Sky Masterson in the musical theater production of Guys and Dolls. So I got a chance to do it all. It was a dream come true, but that idea of getting that scholarship to Florida never came to fruition. But I think at the end, it was a blessing in disguise, because I think it taught me perseverance. It taught me goal setting. It taught me patience and being able to work hard, which paid dividends. As you mentioned, I mean, even coming out of Florida, I'm a second-team All-American. I set the record, the SEC record. At that time, I had the season touchdown receiving record and the career touchdown receiving record. And yet, I didn't go until the sixth round, even though, Mel Kiper had me going in the third or fourth round. I didn't go to the sixth round. So again, here I was trying to prove myself. Over a 10-year period of time, I got cut 10 different times. I moved from city to city 22 different times. It was a very unsettled life, but I think going through what I went through in college prepared me for being able to answer the bell when those challenges and the adversity rose. Luckily, I didn't. I actually signed with the Carolina Cobras in the Arena League. I did not have to play. It was coming off of me tearing my Achilles tendon with the Denver Broncos. I was out of the league. I was thinking, man, I just want to get back into the NFL. I signed with Carolina. And fortunately, I was probably the only person amongst Gator Nation that was happy that Coach Spurrier decided to leave to go to the NFL, because that year he went to Washington. I was one of the first guys that got signed there and really rejuvenated my career. I owe that guy so much. And I know folks listening there in Athens are probably not that excited about Coach Spurrier, but he did so much for me. And if I could speak to the person that he is and what he's done for so many people, including myself, it really kind of transcends that rivalry. He's just an iconic coach in our conference and somebody that I have a great deal of respect for and owe a lot to, both in my production on the field in college and the NFL, and then post playing days. Everything that I do now is because of what he allowed me to do and put me in a position to have the kind of success I did playing.
Yeah, Spurrier is that icon. And when Mark Richt retired, I reached out to him, and he had a really complimentary quote about Mark Richt. He said some nice things about Kirby Smart. He loves it that Kirby wears a visor.
Yeah.
He says he likes seeing the visor on the sideline. And it's funny, and I tell people this freely all the time. The best career advice I ever got was from Steve Spurrier. I was doing a 1994 interview. I was covering Auburn in 93 and 94. That's why when I went to cover Tennessee, I was like, why is everybody freaking out about Florida? I just watched Auburn beat them. I've seen Alabama beat them. Why everybody here freaking out? But I was doing an interview with him, and I said, Coach, this is going to sound like a stupid question, but what makes you such a great coach? And he said, well, my daddy told me there was 2 ways you could be successful. You do it like everybody else, work a little harder at it. You do things different. I choose to do things different. And I took that approach to my journalism and really tried to separate from the pack at practices. And when they were all watching the Alabama offense, I went over and watched the Alabama defense.
Yeah.
And so I'd have different stories. And then I discovered Sean Alexander, and I was writing about him a year before he went for 298. When he finally went off, I'm like, that's right. I call it. But that would have never happened. And that advice was very solvent. And I guess
just to go back before you move on from that, Mike, I think it's important to note he actually said the same thing to us. And when he talked about developing that fun and gun offense, he said, hey, we can do it like everybody else has always done it, or try something completely different. And that's where you saw, route combinations that folks hadn't seen before, more 4 and 5 wide receiver sets. Like literally he came into the SEC and all of a sudden Georgia and Auburn are having to spread it out and throw the football a bunch just to try to keep up. And when you force those teams that are historically running teams into trying to, keep up by changing their offense completely, I think that says a lot about what he was able to do in a different path that kind of revolutionized not only football in the SEC, but I think he changed the landscape of college football in general with what he did offensively in the 90s.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And as those teams adjusted, Chris, for the fun and gun and got lighter faster, Tennessee went big and heavy, and 1998 happened. Because it was almost like, and I don't know if it's like this now, but probably to a certain extent, in the offseason, teams are always preparing for the team you've got to beat. What do you got to be prepared for? And Florida was the team you had to be prepared for. So that was the team you recruited to beat. That was the team that you put guys in position to beat. And if you can do something different, then the heavy game became the different in 98. Now I would say that we're once again seeing teams adjusting to spread, up-tempo. And I think that's why Kirby Smart has stuck with this run game. But now he's made a new hire, and I guess we'll go in this direction now. You've seen that Todd Monken's been brought in. He's a well-traveled offensive mind. You know about Matt Luke, some of the success that he's had as a head coach, as an offensive coordinator. What do you think about the makeup of this new Georgia offensive staff?
Yeah, first of all, I'm a huge fan of Kirby Smart's. Obviously, I played against him briefly there when we crossed years in the 90s. I'm a little bit older than him, but I have great respect for what he means to Georgia and this conference in general, how accomplished he is. I'm excited about, I don't know if you've ever heard the story or not, but Matt Stinchcomb and I were out in Pasadena with Dari Noka for the Rose Bowl a few years back. And if there was any Georgia people that saw me on the sideline, they would have thought Florida was playing. As hard as I was cheering that night for Georgia, I'm an SEC guy. Just got caught up in the excitement of it all. So even though Georgia's a big Florida rival, I'm a fan of the SEC. I'm a fan of what Kirby's created there. And there's a lot to be worried about, but I think I have a great amount of trust in Kirby as well. You mentioned Matt Luke. It was a tough loss losing Sam Pittman, and you can't blame Sam for moving on to have an opportunity to be a head coach in this league. But I think that's a position that you're going to be concerned about, because not only do you lose his guidance and the ability to recruit the way he does, but you lose a lot of talent off that offensive line and that entire offense in general. Unfortunately, I think this idea that Jamie Newman's going to step in and all of a sudden, he's not going to miss a beat from what he did at Wake Forest, and the offense is not going to struggle at all, even though it's an entirely new offense. I think there's some legitimate concerns. And then you factor in the issue with not having spring practice and being able to install and teach and do all the things that typically would go on this year. There are some concerns with the makeup of this offense. Now, the defense is going to be fantastic, but the makeup of the offense, how long is it going to take those guys to get up to speed. And then with the Newman thing, Jamie Newman thing, it reminds me a lot of what Florida went through this year in basketball. Kerry Blackshear transfers from Virginia Tech, and all of a sudden the media names him the SEC preseason player of the year. I thought that was maybe a little bit of a lofty goal, the bar being set too high. I think right now the bar is being set awfully high for Jamie Newman, a guy that hadn't even taken a snap offensively in this conference yet.
Yeah, hadn't even won the job for that matter. And Curry made that clear last week that Carson Beck, a guy from the Jacksonville area, has come in and looked really good in the early spring drills. And Dwan Mathis is a really talented guy that was the Ohio State's quarterback before Justin Fields transferred and Dwan flipped. And he's coming off the brain surgery and expected to get cleared in May. But, here's a 6'6" guy that runs a 10-800 and throw the ball 75 yards. So, there's a lot of questions in the Georgia backfield. DeAndre Swift moving on. Zamir White, I thought, looked good against Baylor, but he didn't look like the number one running back in the country that he was coming out of high school. I like Kenny McIntosh a lot from down there in Pompano Beach, Florida. I think he's a very all-around guy, but he really saw mostly mop-up time, not very proven. James Cook, the younger brother, Dalvin Cook, younger brother, he looked good at times, but I didn't think James Coley really figured out how to use him. Felt like he was underutilized. Felt like Jake Fromm looked off him a couple times when he was open. So to your point, really the most proven guy they've got is George Pickens. And, let's face it, we got to wonder if George can control his emotions on the field. He's going to be and you could probably speak to this, he's going to be a target for every DB out there. And it gets chippy enough as it is between DBs and receivers, Chris.
Yeah. I mean, you've seen it. It's one of the oldest things in time. I mean, defensive backs baiting receivers into doing stupid things that are going to get them penalized or even worse, thrown out of the game. So I think he had some moments of immaturity at times, but that's part of growing up. You make mistakes, you learn from those, and you come back and you're better. I thought he made progress in terms of his production on the field and understanding his role in that offense. Obviously had a big game in the Sugar Bowl against Baylor. So I'm excited about seeing what he can do. But at the same time, it's almost a very similar situation to last year where who are your proven pass catchers? Who are those guys? And again, you're not having the benefit of developing chemistry between pass catchers and quarterbacks this time of year. Not only this spring, but think about it, Mike. The offseason really is a time where quarterbacks are getting guys together in their own free time when they're not allowed to be together in formal practices and running those practices where you're determining not only who are the guys that can play, but who are the leaders on this team? Who are the guys that are going to be able to take that leadership role? And I think that's what Georgia desperately needs to find out, particularly on the offensive side.
Well, I would agree with you. The only thing I would say, and the only reason I think that I don't know that this break works in anybody's favor, big picture, but all things being equal, all teams being limited, I think most offenses, Chris, are going to have to be simple, depending on when they return and how much of a buildup there is to the season. But I think Georgia was going to be simple anyway. They're going to run a lot of RPO. I think a lot of that is fluid, read on the field. The choreography, the timing that some of these other passing games, like, for example, LSU and Joe Burrow had incredible, impeccable timing. Burrow was practically a pro. He didn't have to go to class for 2 years. He was a 2-year graduate training. If you ever wondered what would happen if you put an NFL quarterback in a college system, we saw that at LSU. But now everybody's going to have to be simple. And that's where the pendulum swings because this Georgia defense, man, I know they looked good. And I got to tell you, there's guys named that you're probably not familiar with. I mean, these guys are deep too, Chris. I mean, they're going to play 22, 23 guys in a game, and there won't be any drop-off when they go to these different packages. So that's why I think that the short preparation time could favor Georgia. And I guess I'll just transition right into my next question. We've heard different coaches with different theories about when they would need to be back by. Now, we all know that that's going to be determined by science. That's going to be determined by doctors. That's going to be determined by various forms of government. But we've heard Brian Kelly say, hey, July 1, got to get him training by July 1. We've heard Muschamp say July 15th. We've heard Sam Pittman say, hey, I'm old school. I remember the days when guys like Chris Doering were playing. Some of those guys didn't show back up till August, right? So August 1. What are your thoughts on, in order to have the season kick off on time, when do the guys have to be back training again collectively?
Well, I think you make some good points there. I think most importantly is that everybody's on the same playing field, right? Everybody's off right now. Everybody has the chance to come back at the same time. So nobody really has an advantage. Now, I do think there's players that have a chance to separate themselves from everybody else. The guys that are self-motivated right now, the guys that are disciplined, those folks are going to have an opportunity to give themselves a distinct advantage when the season does roll around. But the thing I worry about when we actually talked to Coach Muschamp the other day on our show, he did mention, I think it was July 13th or July 15th, whatever it was, they wanted to have a month worth of conditioning and then a month worth of install and prep and game planning and all that for the season. I think that month worth of conditioning is important, Mike. Even though everybody's going to come back on the same playing field, there are real injury concerns. When you don't train the way that you need to lay that foundation, to put the size and the agility and stuff together, like, you're opening yourself up for a lot of soft tissue injuries. And I think that is a concern where you'd like to keep the season as full as you possibly can. I think there needs to be some thought as to, hey, are we putting guys in bad positions if we don't give them a legitimate opportunity to condition and get themselves into playing shape? Because it's not like guys are going to go out there and go half speed. They're going to go full speed the way their mind tells them that they're able to go. But without that foundation of the conditioning aspect, I think you could be opening up some guys to some injuries that probably needs to be thought about a little bit more.
So it sounds like you're closer to the July 1 camp that Brian Kelly's putting out there is optimal.
Yeah, I'd say sometime, but in the first 2 weeks of July, I think it would be very important to get that opportunity to get conditioning work in and really lay that foundation I talked about.
And then as far as what type of season it is, and I know Chris Fowler recently came out, and he's not the only one that said it, but I point to Chris Fowler as a real authority on college football. I think, him and Kirk Herbstreit are guys that have done it a long time. Your former Gator Tebow is another great football philosopher. I haven't heard him really say a whole lot about this, but Fowler identified the three basic scenarios here. 1, start on time. 2, start late limited schedule. 3, football in the spring. And I know your answer could change tomorrow, Chris. All of ours could. This is such a fluid situation. But of those 3 scenarios, what do you think is most likely right now?
Well, first of all, I think I would agree with you on those guys that you mentioned as being very knowledgeable about the sport of college football. The problem is that this is not a college football thing. This is a world health thing. And so for anybody to try to prognosticate what's going to happen, I think you're getting a little bit over your skis there at that point in time, because we're not going to be able to do anything until, the public health people let us know that it's okay to get back out. Like, I think we're much more likely, Mike, to see NFL football played as a normal kind of schedule than we will college football. Those guys are getting paid. They can be put into positions where maybe it's a little bit more risky for them because this is their job. I mean, we talk all the time about these guys not being professionals. These players are college athletes that are students first. And so to ask them to be put into a dangerous position that you're not asking your rest of your school. Here in Gainesville, they've canceled summer A, summer B, and summer C. Like, I don't know how you can bring student athletes on campus when you can't bring the rest of the school back. I mean, that's a legitimate concern for me. So I do think the hand has been tipped right now. Everybody's talking about how important it is for college football to be played for the economy of college athletics. In Mike Gundy's opinion, for the economy of the state of Oklahoma. Right. These are important things where now the players are understanding that, hey, we got more leverage than we've ever had before. If we ever wanted to make this name, image, and likeness thing work, now is the time. If we ever wanted to try to make the pay-for-play thing, now is the time, because they understand of all the communication that's gone on, just how important this football season is to be played, whether it's the normal season, whether it's a shortened season, or whether it's a spring season. We all know that the revenue that created during football is going to make a lot of people's budgets for that entire year. So I do think one of the byproducts you'll see from this is a lot more leniency from the NCAA. We've heard stories here recently, Mike, about the voting on the name, image, likeness, and the voting on the immediate eligibility for transfers, which I think you'll see happen. But I do think that the empowerment of the college football player is one of the things that you'll see from all of this.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Commissioner Sankey was talking last week. He did a lengthy interview on the Paul Feinbaum show, and he brought up a number of things in his 10 minutes, and I did a transcript, and I kind of shrunk it down to 3 major points that I took out of Commissioner Sankey's speech. Number 1, that he's still shooting for Labor Day. The fact that he's still that's his mission statement. That's where his mindset's at. Now, he doesn't know if it'll start on Labor Day any more than we do. And he brought up the same points that you did, that this is an issue that goes well beyond collegiate athletics. But one, the fact that Sankey is working towards that. Two, that a task force has been commissioned. Talking to the different athletic directors and the presidents, they do have experts working on this. Obviously, the nation does too. Our government does as well. But so does the college game in terms of how does it apply to the college athletes. And because there are a lot more strings attached, as you were saying, for college players than NFL players. But the third point was his use of a word and a term that I just never heard. And maybe you had, Chris, but he said he was talking to his fellow Autonomy 5 commissioners. Now, I've heard of Power 5 commissioners, but I'd never heard of the Autonomy 5. And to me, that was Greg Sankey's legalese and way of sending a message that the Autonomy 5 is going to be just that. They're going to determine what's best for the Power 5 schools, and we'll move forward from that. The idea that Group of 5 has a voice, it's nice. It sounds politically correct. But in the reality in the college football engine and how the finances work, the dog wags the tail and not the other way around. So what this has led to speculation of, long-winded intro here, and Sankey would say, by no means did I say anything to this effect. But if we're talking about the Autonomy 5, Chris, could this be the division of college football from under the NCAA umbrella?
Yeah, I think it's a very likely scenario that there is some sort of change from this, that either realignment or some sort of breaking away from the NCAA. I can tell you, this. Commissioner Sankey was not happy with the announcement of the cancellation of all the spring championships. He looked like he was completely caught off guard by that news. So the lack of communication there from Mark Emmert, from the NCAA offices, with these guys that are probably more powerful than the NCAA for that matter. I mean, Greg Sankey's one of the most powerful men in sports, and for him not to be considered and talk through all this, I think that really probably didn't sit very well with him. I do think there is a possibility that we'll see some sort of change and breaking away from the NCAA at some point in time. But at the end of the day, I like what you talked about a minute ago. Why are we projecting so far down the road? Let's set goals. Let's reevaluate in 15 days or in 30 days and make sure this thing is a fluid kind of way that we're examining all parts of it, because I thought it was premature too. In hindsight, canceling those spring championships would have happened inevitably. But why did we have to do it at that point in time? I thought it was disrespectful to the Power 5 commissioners, to the athletic directors, and the schools themselves.
Yeah, and that was really the first time to me that Greg Sankey didn't appear to be in control. And Greg Sankey that's not in control of the room doesn't look like a very comfortable or very happy guy. And I'm with you. I thought it was premature. And obviously Sankey did too, because he continued to entertain the thought of an SEC baseball turn. That was his way of letting the NCAA know. And to me, that there was a rift. And, he's on these conference calls with the different commissioners every day for a reason, in my opinion. So I do think there could be some movement on that front. You talk about projecting and you talk about you got to have goal setting. And, one of the things that I've done to try and cover this, Chris, is it's not business as usual. Nothing of that sort. There'd be a spring game this weekend if there was. But I still talk and write a lot about Georgia's football season because they are a championship contender. And there is an NFL draft coming up here April 23rd. That will go on the 23rd, 24th, 25th. I guess I would ask you just about some Georgia players. And we mentioned Swift a little bit earlier. But where did you sit on the whole Jake Fromm NFL prospect? You've seen some very good quarterbacks that didn't necessarily translate to the NFL. Could Jake be one of those guys, or did you see enough from Jake to think that he could be an NFL starter one day?
I love Jake Fromm. I loved him. I mentioned being on that sideline in Pasadena, man, watching him bring his team back, that drive that he put together to send the game to overtime. I mean, he is a guy that has that it factor. He has the leadership that elevates the play of those players around him. And that's not something you can teach. That's something that's innate, that's born, that's a God-given talent. So people that have that have the ability to do that at the next level as well. Are there concerns about height? Yeah, I think there's some concerns, but we've seen Russell Wilson and Drew Brees and some of these other quarterbacks have some success, not being necessarily the prototypical height that you think of with an NFL quarterback. I thought it was interesting that he decided to leave early. And I know maybe you and I disagree a little bit based upon some previous conversations. But for me, it was a message of, hey, I've plateaued with what I can do here. I don't necessarily feel like I can maybe progress any more in my development here, and it's time for me to move on. I thought at times last year I saw him regress a little bit in terms of some of his pre-snap reads, some of his accuracy that he was known for. I think he can get that back, but I think that was part of the reason he moved on. There was a lot of uncertainty with a new offensive system coming in and coordinator, and he felt like he had achieved everything that he could have. It was surprising at the time, but I think in hindsight it makes a little bit of sense to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Chris, and I've kind of given it more thought since the initial announcement. I was in shock just because Jake he's kind of the icon here. He's kind of Tim Tebow light, right? I mean, obviously Tebow won a couple titles and was and is still Mr. Florida now. When you think about a guy whose face you put on the program, and Jake had become that at Georgia, and he'd been through more controversy though. I mean, obviously the transfer of Justin Fields brought up a lot of questions, and people didn't understand it. It wasn't that Georgia was trying to chase off Justin Fields so much as there was going to be a quarterback competition for the position. And, how are you going to pull the chair out from underneath Jake after he's led your team to a championship?
Yeah.
How are you going to promote Justin in a pro-style offense when he's not as quick processing pre-snap as Jake? So it'll be interesting to see how it works out for Jake. My prediction is, and maybe you could speak more to this, I think it has so much to do with where he goes. As much as it is on him, it seems to me that quarterback success is so dependent on the supporting cast and the system. You could probably share some experience with the places you've been.
Yeah, that's completely true. I mean, I think any position, it's about being the right fit, the right offense, the desire of that coach for you to do well, put you in a position to be successful, but even more so in the quarterback position. So I do think it's going to have to be the right fit, and I don't necessarily know what offense it is that he'll be the right fit for, but I do believe that he's got something to prove. I mean, heading into the season, I actually said I liked him better as a pro prospect than I did Tua Tagovailoa. I thought those were the two best quarterbacks in the league heading into the 2019 season. Again, I don't think that Jake Fromm had his best year. I think we'd all agree that there were some things going on around him that didn't necessarily let him play to his highest level, including trying to replace their top 5 pass catchers. But, I do think he still has that potential to be the guy I thought he could have been heading into last season. So I'm excited about him. I'll tell you, too, Mike, I was excited. I erroneously thought last year that DeAndre Swift was going to be the Heisman Trophy winner in the preseason. I said it, and I look stupid now in hindsight. But the NFL is all about, at the running back position, being versatile, being able to do a lot. And we saw him do that. People note sometimes that he hadn't played on third downs in his last couple of seasons. They brought it. Hey, in his freshman season, he was the third down back. I mean, it was Chubb and Michelle, but on third down, DeAndre Swift was coming in. He was catching the ball out of the backfield. They were motioning him out of the backfield. They line him up in the slot. He can do a lot. And I think that versatility is what the NFL is looking for right now. I expect him to be a first-round guy. I know there's some differing opinions on that, but I think he's going to be an extremely productive player at the next level because of all that he's able to do.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I like a lot of DeAndre's game. The versatility is the key. I think he's a lot faster than that 4.48, 4.49 he ran. He had a speed coach. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent here, but one of the trends we've seen are these speed coaches that get guys ready for the combine. And, his speed coach was high-fiving and all. I said, Swift ran a 4.48. You ought to be fired. I've seen this guy outrun everybody. And I'm not necessarily a big fan of these speed coach and go away to South Florida or LA. I've seen a lot of guys train locally and do better, working with the trainer, the strength and conditioning coach that they've known, being surrounded and supported by former teammates, continuing on as leaders. I guess what is your take on NFL draft prep, and are you a believer that they should go to these speed camps, because a lot of them are in Florida, or do you like the idea of a student athlete maybe working with the strength and conditioning coach on his campus?
Well, now you're going to get me fired up and off on a tangent because I am not a guy that performed well at the combine. I mean, unfortunately, training for the combine is training completely different than what you train for during the football season. And so it's like a whole new process of starting all over again for these things that may or may not necessarily translate to success at the National Football League level. I ran a terrible 40 time and came back at pro day and ran better. But, I wasn't necessarily a guy that was going to be able to make people get excited about my 40 or vertical or short shuttle or any of those things. Nowadays, that's the reality. And unfortunately, those things are a byproduct of all the attention and the emphasis that's put on the combine. I mean, people are going to train for that, and they're going to try to gain an advantage every way they can. Back in my day, when coming out after the 95 season in preparation for the 96 draft, we didn't have those places where you could go off and train. We had to do it at home. I did work with Mike Holloway, who was the track coach at Florida. He worked with me some there, but it is it's definitely a completely different world now. The amount of money that they spend on it, because there's an awful lot of money to be made. If you go to the combine and show out, there's a lot of money to be made. But I think this is interesting, Mike, this year with the combine really being the only stage for those guys. A lot of pro days didn't happen. There was a couple that did. But now, how is the evaluation by these scouts, these coaches, these general managers? It falls more on the film. How productive were they during their college careers? You can turn on the tape and see who are the guys that are the football players and who aren't. And I think that this is a throwback to the old days for me. You're de-emphasizing what you saw in some of the workouts because you didn't get a chance to do all of that. You didn't get a chance to meet with the players as much as you typically would. And you're having to depend on your eyes and your evaluation skills when you turn on the tape.
I got a question. I haven't written this story yet, so I'm kind of tipping off a story that I'm working on. But I was talking to a former coach, and he brought up an idea for, maybe bringing some revenue back to these college cities. We talk a lot about the potential for no games this season or games without fans. We're really not sure what direction it'll go. Obviously, a lot of money is going to get lost in these cities should either one of those scenarios play out. As far as the spring games go, Chris, like in Georgia, it's the G-Day game. Everybody has their blue and white or crimson and white game, whatever. What about a spring scrimmage? And this coach brought this up to me. He said, how about if you play another team that's not on your schedule in the spring? And I kind of took the idea one step further and said, what about a home and home where you do split squad? And, let's say Georgia and Clemson do split squad scrimmages, and there's one game in Clemson on Sunday and there's one game in Georgia on Saturday, and they split their squads, or maybe there's one game and they go home and home. As a former player, as an analyst, what would you think about a spring game? It wouldn't be a bowl, it wouldn't be a regular season game, it would be a spring scrimmage, but I've got to believe that would be well attended, and I've got to believe that would bring in some revenue.
I love that idea. I mean, I think it'd be a tremendous idea. And we've heard some other similar type scenarios where, hey, let's eliminate some of the FCS games from the regular season and maybe use that as a way we can create some revenue for the FCS school. They come in as part of the spring game. I can tell you spring practice is a lot different for you when you're a freshman and a sophomore than it is when you're heading into your senior year. My senior year, I didn't even play in the orange and blue game. Didn't take part in many of the scrimmages during the spring. It's an opportunity for you to prove yourself as a younger player, but you're a little bit disengaged as you become an older, more established player. So I think that would be a way to keep guys a little bit more engaged during spring practice and to create a little bit more competitive situation. I do think it would be an opportunity to create more fan interest. And at the same time, everybody's looking for ways to create revenue, right? I mean, that's a great revenue producer, not only because of ticket sales to get those games, but television revenue that would have an opportunity to be sold too. So I think that's a tremendous idea. I love the idea of the split squad. I would even be open to some sort of NFL preseason type idea where the team comes in a couple days early and you're working practices together leading up to that spring game that everybody can attend. I think there's some things that you can do that would allow not only competitive situations, but some information sharing. I mean, how many times do coaches go to somewhere else in another conference and pick the brain of I read one of the stories from your site the other day where Kirby went to Texas to pick the brain of Tom Herman on certain things after his offense lit him up when they played in New Orleans, I guess. Those are things that I think could happen that would allow a little bit more collaboration that I think would make the product on the field better too.
Yeah, we'll just put open mics on them during those practices. I'm sure Nick Saban he'll sign up right on top of the list for an open mic. Let me ask you this. I'm going to get to the questions from our audience here in a second, but Steve Spurrier, Nick Saban. Who you taking, Chris?
Here's the thing, man. I am as loyal as I could possibly be. Coach Spurrier, I owe him so much. Outside of my parents, is the most influential person on my life and my entire life. But I think even I would be a little naive to say that Nick Saban's not the greatest coach in the history of college football. The numbers speak for themselves. The trophies speak for themselves. And no disrespect to my coach, but Nick Saban's got to be the guy that I think you take above everybody.
You surprised me there. Lottie Lauderdale, he's one of our commenters on Dog Nation, wants to know, is the gap between Georgia and Florida narrowing talent-wise and coaching-wise?
I think it is. And I'll be honest with you, as an alum of the University of Florida, after the 2017 season when Florida went 4-7 and Kirby stacking recruiting classes on top of recruiting classes, I thought the gap was going to be not only stay the same, but it was going to be increased considerably. The hiring of Dan Mullen was key for Florida at that point in time. I don't think they had the same talent that Georgia did. But after Georgia, I mean, I think what was a couple games in a row, I think Georgia beat Florida 42-3 or 42-7, whatever it was. There was a distinct difference in terms of talent on the field, but also belief. And I think Dan Mullen changed a little bit of the belief. I think going toe-to-toe with Georgia the last couple seasons was big for Florida's evolution as a team, believing they can play with the best. I think the recruiting has come along for Florida. And at the same time, I don't know that there's a better in-game offensive coach than Dan Mullen right now. Dan Mullen's ability to scheme up ways to give his team not only advantages but overcome disadvantages. I mean, when Florida went to Starkville a couple years ago to play against Mississippi State, that was the best defensive line in the country. And one of the weak points for Florida was their offensive line. He neutralized that with the quick passing game. With they ran some speed option stuff, did some things that allowed them to not have those being overmatched in certain ways come back and bite them. And I think Dan Mullen has done a great job of narrowing the gap with talent, but also doing that with his scheming as well.
I was talking with Edgar Thompson earlier today, and you may be familiar with Edgar.
Yeah.
He covers Florida for the Orlando Sentinel, and he was telling me this story. I guess Pat Dooley was actually the first to report it. True or untrue? Did the Florida receivers really have the wrong wristbands on against Georgia? They were saying they had the wrong wristbands, and that was causing all this early confusion in the game on play calls, that it led to a delay of game, that it led to a timeout. Is that a true story, or is that an urban legend?
I have never heard that story. Edgar would probably know, and Pat certainly would probably know. Let me tell you this. It looked uncharacteristically unorganized on the Florida sideline. Not only did they not seem they wasted timeouts. Some of the play calls were questionable after those timeouts, but the lack of composure, I thought, was something that was really telling. You don't see Dan Mullen freaking out the way that he did on the sideline in that game against Georgia. So there could have been something wrong, or that could have just been an excuse to cover it up. But clearly, that was not the normal body language that you see from Florida and the composure they typically have on the sideline.
Edgar thought a good question for you would be to ask you about Kyle Trask and how solid was he entrenched as the starter, or do you think Emory Jones could have challenged him for the starting spot in spring drills?
Well, first of all, I've had the good fortune of being privy to watching scrimmages both in the spring and in the summer camp leading up to the seasons the last couple of years. Every time I watched Kyle Trask get in there, his group always looked like they had more chemistry. They looked like they had a little bit more rhythm. He knew where to go with the ball, and I was always confused as to why he wasn't getting more of an opportunity. I don't know if that was out of loyalty to Felipe Franks or because of the potential that he had with his size and his physical characteristics. But at the end of the day, when Kyle gets in there, he knows where to go with the football, and he throws with great accuracy. The one thing I'd like to see from him is being able to get the ball out of his hand a little bit quicker. Sometimes he holds it a little longer. That clock has to go off in your head where you got to get rid of the football and avoid the sack, and more importantly, the strip sack, which happened to him multiple times last year. But I was impressed when Emory came in against Auburn. I was worried for Florida that he was going to come in and be very one-dimensional. He actually they ran some zone read stuff, which you expect to see from him, but he also threw a couple dig routes in the middle of the field with great accuracy and timing that allowed the chains to move and to eat up some clock. So I don't expect to see Emory win that job this year. I'm hopeful that he's patient enough to see what the future is for him. I think you'll see some packages develop to get him involved in the game like you did this year. Down in the red zone, he's a real weapon with what he can do with his legs too. But I don't think that Kyle loses that job this year. I think he has waited around, and this is his time to shine. And it's crazy, Mike, isn't it? Think about last year when we went to Hoover. 9 teams brought quarterbacks as their representatives to media days. This year, who is it? It's Mond at A&M. It's Trask at Florida, and Frank's maybe the most experienced player in the conference as he goes to Fayetteville at Arkansas.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I got a question from Devin Hickson. Back to Jake Fromm. What team do you think is his best fit? He throws New England out there and New Orleans. Is there another team, or do you think one of those 2 teams would be a better fit for Jake Fromm with his style of play?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those would be great. I think not only, we talked about his leadership earlier and that it factor that raises the play of everybody else around him, but he seems to be a very cerebral guy as well, a guy that can process a lot and process it quickly. So I could see New England being a place where they put a lot on their players and expect them to be able to know a lot of different things and be able to adjust on the fly. I think New Orleans is a natural place because, Drew Brees, there's a lot of comparisons between those 2 guys in terms of size. But is maybe for that same comparative sense is Seattle a place that he might do well. So Wilson being out there, Seattle's at their best offensively when they're playing off the play action pass. That's something I thought Jake Fromm did really well at Georgia. When Georgia's offense was hitting big plays, it was off the play action pass. So that might also be a good fit for him as well.
Yeah, good stuff. Someone was asking me on our Dog Nation thread, our Dog Nation forum, do you see anything innovative with how Florida is keeping these players active? And how does Florida's leadership, when we talk about leaders, you mentioned Trask, I've got to believe he's one, but what does their leadership structure look like? And what have you seen from the Florida staff to keep their players engaged? I know at Georgia, we've seen a lot of player videos and the strength and conditioning coach doing some videos.
Well, first of all, I think Florida's fortunate to have Nick Savage. Nick Savage is one of the best strength and conditioning coaches in the entire country. A young guy that can really relate with the players and yet is able to push them and get a lot out of them. You've seen some considerable body transformation since he's taken over there. So he's doing everything he can to stay engaged and push those guys remotely. I think you mentioned it earlier that everybody's kind of on the same page here, the same playing field, missing spring practice. I think Florida is actually built to weather that missed practice time better than anybody else because you look at it, they return so much on both sides of the ball. You have a 5th-year senior quarterback. You have an offensive line that should be better this year. You lose your top 4 receivers, but there's a bevy of guys that have been around for a long time. And maybe most importantly, you have continuity in the coaching staff. I mean, there has been very little turnover, which I think is important because not only are you going to be utilizing the same scheme on both sides of the ball, but there's always already existing relationships. And I think right now, as I've talked to a lot of the coaches, not only at Florida, but elsewhere in this conference, the main point of emphasis in communication, while you'd love it to be teaching, and certainly the NCAA is allowing these guys to have time where they're doing some installation or film study, but really it's just making sure guys are okay. I mean, I thought football for me, Mike, was great because it provided structure, it provided discipline. You had to be a part of something, and it didn't let you just go out there and freelance on your own. And that's what I worry about these guys not having that structure during this time. Forget all the other stuff, the training and the nutrition, that's important, but just being a part of something. I think the coaches that I've talked to have really emphasized the need to have everybody engaged and having those calls be more wellness checks than anything else.
Yeah, Commissioner Sankey mentioned that as a big part of why he wants those players on campus this fall. He kind of sidestepped the question of could you have players on campus but not students, but he did mention that as a priority to maintain this relationship that the players have with the school. And I have a question from Clay Ware. He says it appears you and I are both on the same page with Georgia, Florida being atop the East. Who do you think the number 3 team in the East Division will be next season?
Wow. I mean, right now, we have Tennessee with the 2nd longest winning streak in the country. I believe in what Jeremy Pruitt's building there. I don't think you can sleep on Mark Stoops up in Lexington either. I mean, I really believe there has been a transformation in that program. They are putting recruiting classes together to be able to close the gap between the top teams in the East and where they are. They believe a lot more. So I think it probably comes out of either Knoxville or Lexington, in my mind, as the next nearest challenger to Florida and Georgia.
It's great stuff, Chris. I can't thank you enough for all the time that you've given us here today. I know we were going to go the other night. We had some technical issues. I'm glad we were able to pull it out of the fire today. And I'm glad you had an opportunity to share some opinions. And maybe, when you do your commentary now, what always strikes me is when I'm listening to you or Jacob Hester or Tebow or Herb Street, and I realize some of these young fans don't realize just what a great player you were. Some of these other guys were, what you've accomplished. I mean, I guarantee you that people don't realize that you still hold that touchdown receiving record in the SEC. As great as the fun and gun was, I mean, you were kind of the ultimate target for what I still consider the glory days of Florida. No, nothing against Urban Meyer, and I know he has 2 titles and Spurrier has 1. But to me, that's the Florida that I think that Dan Mullen's trying to get back to. That's what they're trying to emulate. That was a more fun era, and as bright and as wonderful as the guy as Tebow was, there was just something a little dark about Urban Meyer that the Spurrier teams, you guys seem to have a lot of fun out there, and you represented yourself, I thought, very well off the field as well as on the field.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, we rarely had people getting in trouble. I think we had a lot of good guys on the team and on the coaching staff that really enjoyed being together with one another. I really think the most important thing back then was the love of the University of Florida that Coach Spurrier had. I mean, being there as a player, as a Heisman Trophy winner, you knew how much it meant to him to be a part of the program and elevating it to the next level. And so I think we all kind of appreciated that and had that same sort of love for our school and just the opportunity to compete. He was the ultimate competitor and a guy that loved to go out there. We knew it was Georgia week. I know we're talking to a lot of Georgia fans. He knew it was Georgia week. We could tell it was Georgia week by the way he acted when he came into the meeting rooms and on the practice field. And that was a game that, whether you're a Georgia fan or you're a Florida fan, I think we can all agree it's the best rivalry. Forget the Iron Bowl, and I know you may speak otherwise because you've been on both sides of that. But I love this Florida-Georgia rivalry, and I am excited that those 2 teams are atop the East as we head into this next season.
You talk about what made Spurrier great, Chris. We might as well have been hearing you talk about Kirby Smart, former player in the program, got that visor going. He gets up for Florida. He says they prepare for all of them the same, but that was a different Georgia that I saw that Saturday in Jacksonville. So a lot of those same attributes. I believe that when I covered Philip Fulmer at Tennessee. I thought that when these guys are a product of that school, that they're in it for the long term. It's a destination job. And certainly Kirby and Spurrier couldn't be more different in terms of both sides of the ball, but a lot of similarities there. And I think a lot of mutual respect. When I told Steve Spurrier that I wanted to interview him about Kirby Smart, if the old ball coach don't want to talk to you about something, let's just talk about something else.
Yeah.
But he was willing, and I think he likes Kirby Smart.
I think you're right about that too. And I can tell you this, Mike, I've played, at the high school level, the college level, the professional level. The coaches that I've been able to respect the most and connect with the most are the guys that played at that level. For somebody, and no disrespect for the guys that didn't, but guys that actually played at that level, and more importantly in this discussion, played at that school at that level. There's something to be said about the way they communicate things, and to be able to turn on the film and see them out there doing the same thing on the same field, it gives them a little bit added legitimacy. So I love that Coach Smart is back there in Athens. I'm excited about what he's building, and I agree. There's a lot of similarities between Coach Spurrier and Kirby and what how they go about it and their love, more importantly, for their alma maters.
Only 2 schools to go to the SEC's championship game 3 years in a row. Kirby's going to try and break that record. Chris, thanks again for joining us. I look forward to being back on SiriusXM with you. Love doing the show with you and Jacob, man. That was always a great wake-up call, and eager to get back on that program as well.
Yeah, we appreciate you always making time for us as well. And hopefully, man, I tell you, the great part about it, we have an opportunity right now, as bad as everything is, we have an opportunity to entertain folks when they're at home, to provide some happiness to them and create content. So I'm excited. If you need me in the future, man, let's make sure we hook up and do our best to keep people engaged with the SEC.
I'll take you up on it. Thanks a lot. Chris Doering, former Florida receiver, former Florida great. He's in the Georgia-Florida Hall of Fame. He's in the Florida Hall of Fame. He was an All-American. He was an All-SEC guy, played in the NFL, played in the arena, just a baller, former walk-on under Steve Spurrier. Really appreciate that Chris joined us today. And, now I want to take a moment to appreciate our sponsor, Ingles. Ingles does so much in their community, and so many of the people that are watching here today rely on Ingles. And we've got a very special video that we'd like to play and thank Ingles and thank all the people that work at Ingles for what they're doing at this difficult time.
It's in our hearts to feel for you. There's been ups and downs, turnarounds, good days and some bad, but we stand together for worse and for better. We'll always have your back with open arms, heart to heart, hand in hand, community strong.
Well, Mike Griffith here, and again, you've been watching Chris Doering and myself talking about all the issues with college football. It's been a fun program. Of course, Chris played for Florida, but I think you saw a very objective viewpoint on a lot of different things. Certainly he loves Florida and Steve Spurrier, and what Gator wouldn't love the King Gator and wouldn't speak well of his school. I hope we got to all your questions. I did my best to go into the chat and see some of the questions. Lottie Lauderdale, great point, Lottie. I thought that Chris had awesome analysis as well. And Leonard Bailey wants to know the information to follow Chris. Leonard, I'll jump back in this thread after this program ends here in a couple minutes and put that information for you out there. But it was interesting to talk about the spring games. I know there's been some interviews done in the past and maybe seeing two different schools play. I'm going to do a story on that in the very near future on Dog Nation. Right now, I got a story up today. You might have read about Tommy Bush, some videos I put up as Georgia. One of the questions Doering asked, and rightfully so, the receiving corps. After George Pickens, then who? Demetrius Robertson is the guy that has the most catches coming back with 30. But after him, there's kind of a drop-off. Dominic Blaylock, not sure about his health. So not a lot of experienced guys. I think Matt Landers had 10 catches. He's a guy that's going to be in position to make plays. But Tommy Bush is a name to remember. Tommy was the guy that ran a 4.4 40 coming out of high school in Texas. He was ranked the number 37 receiver in the country back then. Big 6'5", 205-pound target. He's going into his redshirt sophomore year. And as these videos on Dog Nation will show you, he is looking very good in his workouts. So also a couple other stories I wrote. I want to direct you to that Kirby Smart story. And I know we talked about it a little bit Sunday night, but if you didn't catch that chat on Sunday night, Kirby kind of opened up the defensive playbook as far as how Georgia defends against hurry-up offenses. And I thought it was fascinating, some of the stuff that he and Dan Lanning and Glenn Schumann were able to come up with to counteract this. And it went all the way back to the Alabama-Ohio State game when Kirby was the D coordinator there, and Ohio State beat him. And he went over to Tom Herman, who was then the Houston head coach. You remember Herman was the Ohio State offensive coordinator and then became the Houston coach. So Kirby goes to him and say, "What did you see from us at Alabama?" "Well, your interior line was too big. We thought we could run you sideline to sideline," pointed out some other deficiencies. And so Kirby went back to Bama and retooled. And Herman also put him in touch with Todd Orlando. And Todd Orlando was Herman's D coordinator at Texas in the Sugar Bowl just a couple years ago, and really kind of helped Kirby's defense evolve into what it is now, this mint front, this 3-4 front that is so adaptable and can change so quickly against the hurry up. You'll want to read that story. That's one. And I know I throw out this story and that story, but this is one. If you're a football junkie, you got to read it. It gives you some great insight into a lot of the X's and the O's and some of the brainstorming that goes on and things that make Kirby Smart such a great coach. And look, Kirby's smart enough to say, hey, they aren't his ideas. All these coaches network. Everybody looks at different things. The key is to be able to know which different things should you try to implement yourself, and can you match your talent to that scheme? That's what separates coaches. Anybody can get on Madden or the old NCAA games and see how the plays are drawn up. But the coaches are the best, are the ones that can find the plays that fit their talent and that can find the players that can fit, conversely, that can fit the scheme. And now that Kirby is going into year 5 at Georgia, he's had a full recruiting cycle, and that's why I believe this Georgia defense is the best in the country. And I agreed with Chris Doering about a lot of things, but I could tell he was a little bullish, a little bull gatorish on Florida over Georgia, and he knows I think Georgia's going to win the East, and I say that objectively. I don't say that because I covered Georgia, because I've covered football a long time, and I know what a championship program looks like, and Georgia has one right now. We just all have to get through this summer. We have to stay safe, continue to do the social distancing. The more we abide by these rules and the legislation, the quicker we're all going to be back functioning as a society once again. But for now, I want to thank all of you for joining me on this Ingles on the Beat segment. Each Tuesday in that noon, 1 o'clock hour, I'm going to come to you. I've got a show on Friday night and on Sunday night, and I'll continue to try and bring more guests on. We had Michael Barnett on Sunday night. Hopefully you got a chance to see that. Last Tuesday, we had Cole Kubelik on. So want to thank Chris Doering again for coming on the show. He does a great job with ESPN. I think he's a tremendous analyst. And I want to thank Ingles for their sponsorship and making this program happen. And finally, we couldn't do it without Michael Carvel, our producer. This guy, we've had to jump through a lot of hoops to keep this programming coming. There's been a lot of technical challenges behind the scene. So thank you, Michael, for making this happen. Everybody, have a great Tuesday, and thanks again for joining me.